Hello and welcome. I'm Martha Broad. I'm the Executive Director of the MIT Energy Initiative, and we are really happy to have everyone here. We're going to have an amazing lineup. We have a two-part presentation tonight, and we're going to start out with this report and the authors who are going to share with us where we are with fusion energy, and they've spent a good amount of time over the past year or two working on this. Then we will follow that with presentations from the Plasma Science and Fusion Center, faculty and researchers, about their exciting current research into this promising technology. And to get us started, it is my pleasure to introduce MIT Professor Ann White. She is the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President of Research and Administration and the School of Engineering Distinguished Professor of Engineering at MIT. Welcome, Ann.
Well, thank you, Martha, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to have been asked to say just a few words and offer you a brief introduction to the potential of harnessing fusion energy. Fusion energy is an extremely attractive energy source. It's abundant, it's clean, it's safe. We're going to combine light nuclei to form heavier nuclei, releasing energy according to Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared. Now, we're going to do this with some hydrogen isotopes, deuterium and tritium. We're also going to need some lithium in our fuel cycle, at least in the most likely near-term fuel cycle. And thankfully, the deuterium and lithium are pretty available, and the tritium can be produced. So fusion power plants will not produce any carbon dioxide directly, no direct greenhouse gases. Fusion is also inherently safe. There are minimal proliferation risks, minimal land and water use, and no energy storage issue. So is this sounding too good to be true? Yeah, but thankfully it's not. The great news is fusion on the grid is a lot closer than you think. And I'm not going to steal the next speaker, Professor Armstrong's thunder, telling you why now is the moment for fusion. But I will just reiterate, the potential and the promise of fusion energy to completely transform our approach to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation is really tremendous. And that promise means that getting fusion on the grid is both an intellectual and scientific grand challenge, and also a true societal call to action. And in that sense, the work that MIT has done on fusion, from many of the speakers that you're going to hear from today, and also many others who are not here in the room today, represents the kind of ambitious, impact and solutions-oriented work and collaboration with external stakeholders that will be the focus of the new climate project at MIT. And MIT is a special place both for fusion energy research and climate action. MIT has that special sauce of entrepreneurship, including in the areas of deep tech. We have a culture of problem solving, of always trying to lower the barriers to collaboration across disciplines, and a history also of mobilizing very large sections of our MIT community around these hard problems. And not just ourselves on campus, but of course, we have the breadth of our partnerships as a strength as well. Working with cities, with states, with communities in the area of climate and infrastructure planning and policy, and we work with national governments on developing, testing, and evaluation of new policy tools. This diversity of partners is essential for making progress on the climate challenge. And we, of course, also have a global reach and a global network as well, working with other universities, governments, companies, and nonprofits around the world, especially in places who need climate solutions now more than ever, not tomorrow. So I truly hope that you enjoy this very exciting event, learning more about the transformational potential of fusion energy, and you're really in for a treat because you're going to be hearing from some of the absolute top researchers in this field and also some of the most wonderful folks I know and have the pleasure of working with at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center here at MIT. So thanks very much. I'll turn it over to Professor Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Professor White. So in this study, as Professor White mentioned, MIT is a great place for collaboration across disciplinary boundaries. The study that we're going to dive into here in the first half of this program brought together some 30 different researchers from many different disciplines, ranging from nuclear science and engineering to economics to policy. And I think that interaction is typical of studies we've done at MIT and other parts of campus, where those different perspectives are just essential to develop the kind of insights we're after in how to move forward as fast as we can. As Professor White mentioned, fusion has long captured the imaginations of many who are interested in zero carbon or emissions-free energy. With more than 40 startups today and more than 100 government projects in the fusion area, there's never been as much momentum and enthusiasm for the role that fusion might play in the future energy systems. Two characteristics make fusion particularly well suited for the future energy system. One is that you get carbon-free firm power. By firm, I mean that whenever you need the power, it's there in the amounts that you need. That's not only essential for future energy systems, it's not easy to find carbon-free or emissions-free firm energy sources. Nuclear fission is another contender in that space. There's some other contenders that aren't demonstrated yet, but fusion is one that's particularly attractive because in addition to the characteristics of firm power, zero emissions, it's also energy dense and scalable. So it has the potential to transform the system globally as we move to a net zero emissions future. So this is the time to understand just how fusion could impact future energy systems, what the scale of that impact could be, and how it might play out globally. And that's what we look at in this study. Among other things that we looked at in the study, we looked at how fusion will complement and coexist with other low-carbon technologies, intermittent technologies like solar and wind, deployment scale and global distribution of fusion as we move forward, sensitivity of fusion's penetration to the system to cost, sensitivity to emissions constraints as governments start to ratchet down the allowed emissions in our economy, sensitivity to renewable resources regionally around the world, and critical materials and supply chains for implementing fusion at large scale. So not only can this understanding be helpful for strategic planners and policymakers, but also for those involved in fusion commercialization. Because the study allows us to look at economic targets for the use of fusion in electricity markets. So this helps better quantify for developers of fusion technology, people doing cutting-edge research, what the target pricing needs to be, what availability, and what load following these fusion plants in the future need to be able to achieve. So to dive into the study, I'd like to turn the program over to Randy Field. He is the Director of Research at MIT, and he's also was Executive Director of this study, which means he is largely responsible for the great results you see here. Randy.
Thank you very much, Professor Armstrong and Professor White. And I'd like to thank all of you here today who are attending this MIT event. Before I discuss the fusion study itself, I will take the opportunity to give you the very basic overview of fusion. As Professor White said, basically fusion is the fusing of two nuclei, and in doing so, you produce a tremendous amount of energy, well over 1 million times the amount of energy from burning a fossil fuel. And as already stated by both Professor White and Professor Armstrong, the beauty of fusion energy, it does not generate greenhouse gases. It has a very high energy density, very small amount of land required for such a power plant. And yet to enable fusion to be deployed at scale, we have to have a means by which we can produce the very high temperatures that and bring the fusion fuel together in confinement in order to allow them to fuse together. And there are various categories of confinement technology. One method is known as magnetic confinement, where you use very strong magnetic fields to enable the fuel ions to be confined and to be in close contact with each other and away from the walls of the reactor. Another method is called inertial confinement, where you use lasers or projectiles to rapidly compress a fuel capsule in order to achieve very high temperatures and confinement. And the third method for the third category for confinement is known as magneto-inertial confinement, which is really a combination of the two prior methods. These confinement methods have been successfully demonstrated in experiments and and fusion has been achieved. However, the challenge is that really in the engineering, the material science, and in the economics, commercial success of fusion requires that we build an economically viable device to handle the very high temperatures and the high energy particles that are released by fusion, and also have the ability to convert the released energy into electricity. Each fuel type in each confinement method has its own set of engineering challenges and innovative solutions. As Professor Armstrong stated, given the great potential of fusion, it deserves a close examination to understand how fusion power could transform the electricity generation systems in the decades ahead. We started this project in the fall of 2022, and we organized the analysis along 4 major work streams. One of those is examining the global deployment of fusion power plants in all regions of the world out to the end of the century. The second work stream was examining the sub-regional grid scale, at the grid scale, to understand how fusion would fit with the generation mix when there are different types of resources available in different parts of the regions. We also assessed what the critical materials are in manufactured components that are needed to enable the build out of the fusion power plant fleet, and to understand what the bottlenecks could be in that build out. And lastly, we took a close look at the cost drivers for a fusion power plant to understand what those cost drivers are and how they could be addressed. I also want to point out this study is intentionally not making predictions about when fusion will be deployed at a commercial scale, and we're not identifying which fusion technology will be first or what it will cost. But we are instead conducting a scenario analysis and a sensitivity analysis to understand the conditions at which fusion can be deployed at scale and commercially successful. So with that introduction, I'd like to now move on to the key findings of the study with presentations by different members of the team. I'll be starting with Sergei Paltsev, who led the global analysis workstream for the study. And Sergei is an economist, and he's the deputy director of the MIT Center for Sustainability Science and Strategy. And he's also a senior research scientist at the MIT Energy Initiative.
Well, thank you, Randy. Well, one thing which at least I've learned from this particular study is be careful what you wish for. And let me explain why. So several years ago, I was in one of the wonderful MIT conferences in wonderful Madrid, Spain. And I was presenting, well, what we typically do, energy scenarios, what are the transition risks, what are the physical risks. So we have this big economy-wide tool which covers all global regions. So I'm doing my typical story. And the second speaker on that conference was Dennis White. And he has done very exciting speech about fusion. And, well, I was a little bit skeptical, but I saw that the public was sold. I'm like, wow. But in our scenarios, we don't really have any fusion represented. If you're going to take a look into any, I don't know, international energy outlook or, well, any other outlooks which are trying to project where we are going, you're not going to see any fusion in all these outlooks all the way to 2100. So I thought, oh, that would be a great study. That would be a great addition to what we do in order to understand how fusion is going to fit all these things. And about half a year later, completely unrelated, Randy showed up at my office and said, oh, we are thinking about doing a fusion study, so why don't you try and see what's the story in terms of the economics of the fusion? And, well, here are the results, and here were kind of my previous electrical engineering training. So by my first degree, I'm an electrical engineer. But then I switched to what I typically joke with the dark side. So I got my PhD in economics. And as you're very well aware, economists are quite skeptical people, right? So we even have a term, economics is a dismal science. So we're always skeptical about something. And so this is where I came to the study where I was a little bit skeptical because the first question which I had, why do we need fusion, right? So with all the electrification, with all wind and solar and other things, and by 2050 we are going to be at net zero anyway, why we need this expensive technology, and why do we need to kind of bring that? And, well, I put that into our model, and we get some of the results, well, which were in the end not that surprising, but kind of taught us again that, well, whatever the story, we need to make sure that everything adds up in terms of all the components. And as Professor White and Professor Armstrong and Randy Field already mentioned, we had a lot of opportunities from fusion, but a lot of challenges on the technology side. And the point which we are trying to make, at least, well, my part of the study, is trying to understand what are the economic opportunities and economic challenges. And so these two simple curves is an attempt to understand, well, what's the value? What's the value of society? What's the value for the society if we are going to develop the fusion? And we have done a very simple experiment where we, first of all, run the scenarios where we are achieving the Paris Agreement goals. So kind of on the separate activities, we have our MIT Global Change Outlook, where we are developing different pathways how to get to 1.5 and the different regimes with overshoot, without overshoot, and so on. So in all of the scenarios in this particular study, we are achieving 1.5 goal. And then what we have done, we try to understand what kind of information, what kind of signpost we can give to the technology developers in terms of the cost performance of this technology. In other words, well, how cheap, how much you need to reduce the cost of overnight capital cost or overall cost in order to make sure that economically it makes sense. It means that we didn't force any particular technology, but we have done the emission reduction scenario, and technologies are competing based on the economics. So we are not forcing the fusion. We are trying to find what are the conditions where the technology is making the economic sense. And so these particular two curves shows you the value for the global society between two cases where fusion were never invented versus where the cost of the fusion, and you're going to see kind of this abbreviation in terms of the overnight capital cost. Well, these are the numbers for 2050. So it means that kind of initially it starts much higher and then it's going lower. So in the report, there are actually trajectories, what we project in terms of the costs. But what we have done is try to understand what is the value. And you see, well, those are non-trivial numbers, and you can actually aggregate those numbers and compare, and it turns out that, well, under this condition where the overnight cost is about $8,000 per kilowatt, then, well, if you're going to compare the cumulative GDPs with and without, you are actually gaining about, well, 0.4, 0.5% of the global GDP. And if you are reducing cost even more, you are gaining about, well, close to 1% of the global GDP. So, well, that comes as an additional benefit. So you're still meeting the same reduction. You're still meeting the same target, but you are actually helping the society to reach the target if indeed you are going to reach this quite aggressive goal in terms of the reduction in the cost of this technology. So we also have looked at the, well, how much, what's the contribution in terms of the share. And you see that, well, we run different scenarios and kind of, well, we run actually many more scenarios, but we're focusing on this depending on the different costs. Take a look at that top color. I'm not sure on my slide it's like magenta. Over there it's somewhat something else, but kind of you see that top color. And the point is, well, you still see that color and the different assumptions about the capital cost and the numbers that it gives you the global share between 10% and almost half of the electricity which is coming from the fusion. And, well, there are two main drivers behind that. Well, one, as you can see from these figures, the world needs more and more electricity. And so the huge driver is electrification. And by the time where you start exhausting the resources for wind and solar, and then by the time where the cost of integration of intermittent renewables, intermittent sources getting harder and harder to manage, well, this is where the story for fusion comes. And so this is actually the story for any carbon-free dispatchable technology. As long as you can invent, well, you can label it fusion, you can label it whatever else. So that's the value of something which you are going to create and you can deliver and put into the system. And obviously, well, there are a lot of things which are going to affect these numbers. And again, we try to understand some of them. And you can see, well, kind of a lot is going to depend on, well, if we are going to create almost free storage of energy. Well, then it will go into different solution. Well, that's another kind of big if. But there are certain things which obviously is going to affect the trajectory, but also you can see that the need, initially kind of we see the jump in fusion kind of by mid-century in the US and Europe mostly, but by the end of the century where Africa demands much more energy, where all this electrification is happening in India and other places, this is where we see the uptake, the need for that technology. And another point is, well, obviously this is very aggregate look at the problem. And so later on, you will see a little bit more detailed exploration. And again, in the report, we are doing much more detailed exploration. And even that detailed exploration is kind of not representing all the challenges and all the things which are going to affect the development of this technology. And so the exact numbers, obviously, you need to kind of take that with very big degree of caution. But the trajectory is simple. So with all these uncertainties, one message becomes very, very clear. Well, with appropriate resolution of technological issues, with appropriate resolution of regulatory issues which are going to be needed to support this technology, we will have a big impact, and that is going to help our society to reach the aggressive climate goals at cheaper cost to the society in comparison if, well, we would not really spend our effort right now. But in order to deliver that by mid-century, well, we need to start doing this planning, this R&D, this story right now, and that's exactly what we are going to hear later on. That's exactly what MIT is leading the world. And I can tell, well, I kind of recently traveled in all places, Australia, Brazil, Barcelona, and well, they're all asking, well, guys, you're at MIT. Well, how you're going to create that wonderful technology which is going to save the world? And well, so far, the secret sauce is coming from this technology, and we will see if that's going to be delivered. So you see that, after all, I'm not that skeptical economist, but at least I've been sold by Dennis. So now I'm going to switch to, I'm not sure whom, but Randy will choreograph that.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Amanda Farnsworth recently graduated from MIT with her PhD in chemical engineering, and she was a key contributor to the sub-regional grid analysis workstream for this study. Unfortunately, she can't join us here tonight, so I'll be presenting her piece of this work. In this analysis, we basically looked at different regions of the United States, 9 different regions based upon how the grid is organized in the United States, and asked the question of how fusion would penetrate those markets differently, and analyzed how that relates to the resources they have in each of those subregions. And if we start in the far left column, we see that 2 regions, so-called Atlantic and Southeast region of the United States, they had the greatest penetration of fusion, basically at a price point of $6,000 per kilowatt. Fusion would be deployed regardless of the carbon cap being between 1 and 50 grams per kilowatt hour. And let me just give you a reference point for that. Recently, the U.S. average grid carbon intensity was about 450 grams per kilowatt hour. So we're talking about deep decarbonization. And what this means is as you force the grid to have lower and lower carbon intensity, it forces you to look at what are my least cost, least carbon intensive technologies to do that. And so the more you press down on the decarbonization, the more you need the renewables, and the more you need things such as fusion. And so is what we see here is that in the Atlantic and Southeast region, because of the nature of their current resources, that's where you had the highest penetration of fusion. And we examined the specific characteristics. One is that those regions have fairly poor onshore wind resources. They have very little hydro and very little geothermal resources. They, of course, have solar, but solar has the characteristic of being diurnal in its resource, meaning you'll have great resources during the day and very poor resources at night. So there's a great demand for firm power such as fusion, and that's one of the reasons why we saw highest penetration in that region. That contrasts quite a bit with the far right column where we look at north central and Texas, where you have not only solar, but you also have abundant, high quality, low cost onshore wind, which gives you a better diversification in lower cost resources. And so what you see in that case is that you only have penetration of fusion if your carbon constraint is 4 grams of CO2 per kilowatt or less. Now it's interesting that even though it has a penetration only at the lowest levels, if you push it down to 1 gram per kilowatt hour, even in that case, you can have situations of 25 to 45% penetration of fusion in the market. So again, it says there's a very high sensitivity to the carbon constraint, but those regions do take on fusion in those situations. And I'll contrast that with the Northwest, where in that case, you have a great diversity of renewable energy, including you've got wind resources that are, say, average, but you have excellent diversity of resources, including the hydro and geothermal in those regions. And so what you see there is a relatively low sensitivity to the carbon cap, but the penetration never gets above 26% in that region. So that's just a snapshot of the work that Amanda and colleagues did for that cross-analysis between the different subregions of the United States. But what it really points out is even in a single country, depending on the region you're in, you can have tremendously different resources, and those resources can drastically impact the deployment of fusion. Okay, and with that, I will now turn over to, I'll now introduce Rory McDonald, who received his PhD in nuclear science and engineering at MIT, and he is a research scientist at the MIT Energy Initiative, and he worked on the sub-regional grid analysis of this project, and he zoomed in on the potential role of fusion in the New England area of the United States.
Thanks very much, Randy. So we studied fusion's future role in the New England grid in 2050 using a GenX model of ISO New England and Quebec Hydro's resources at 3 different emission intensity limits. This is a region with relatively limited land for onshore wind and solar PV, and so other clean and low emission resources have an important role to play in meeting increasing demand. And this analysis modeled the fusion plants in a bit more detail and added more constraints to the grid. So as well as looking at 20 years of demand, correlated demand and weather data. So these 3 plots show the fusion fleet installed capacity, generation and annual capacity factors as a function of the plant investment costs. The left plot shows how the fusion fleet grows as the costs come down, and the different segments correspond to substitution for different alternatives or combinations of alternatives. The ISO New England peak load in these scenarios was about 60 gigawatts, so that 50% highest value corresponds to about a 30 gigawatt fleet. The rightmost point of each curve is the capital cost at which the first fusion plant entered the grid, so this can be thought of essentially as a cost target for fusion developers. The cost targets were $6,500, $8,000, and $14,000 per kilowatt for the 50, 12, and 4 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour emission intensity limits. All the alternatives were modeled with 2050 costs, which means that these cost targets are a little lower than they might be, but they also use 2050 emission limits, which are very aggressive, and so that would make them higher than they might otherwise be. The center and right plots show the generation and capacity factors as a function of the costs. At high emission intensity limits, we saw what we kind of expected. The fusion plants, the fusion fleet, if they're relatively expensive, act as base load. And as the cost, or if the costs come down, they substitute for more resources. You see more generation and lower capacity factors. But we were surprised to see at the 4 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour emission limit, very expensive plants were operating as not quite as peakers, but at low capacity factors. And this is because the alternatives in those sorts of scenarios where you couldn't run the natural gas combined cycle with CCS unit plants for more than roughly 1,000 hours per year, your alternative was to build a lot more or a lot of extra renewables and storage, which was very expensive. And so as long as fusion plants were able to be relatively flexibly operated, they could also be expensive and still enter the grid. So clearly this analysis depends heavily on the alternatives that fusion plants are competing with, and natural gas units with CCS were the most important of those. So as a comparison just for this presentation, we're showing what the installed capacity of the fusion fleet is with and without natural gas units in the grid. And we can see that if you don't allow for any natural gas or CCS, you essentially increase all those cost targets I talked about before by $4,000. And we're not saying that natural gas units with CCS aren't going to be available in New England in 2050, But we wanted to look at this scenario because there are plenty of places in the world where natural gas is not as cheap as it is here. And it's not clear that large-scale carbon sequestration is going to be possible in all parts of the world. So, and finally, we assumed a fixed 95% carbon capture rate for all CCS units, regardless of how the plant operates. And the more we look into it, the more that doesn't seem like it's always going to be the case. And so for all those reasons, there may be scenarios where CCS units have a much lesser role to play and fusion can step in. Now, corollary, there are also other technologies that could step in, and that's something that we didn't consider in as much detail, but kind of can be a topic of future work. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Randy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rory. So, Professor Dennis White, just for clarity, and postdoc Theodore Martitis led the work stream looking at the supply chains for materials and manufactured parts for fusion. Our assessment found that different technologies were at very different stages of maturity. And in the report, we identify the issues as well as the potential bottlenecks in the supply chain for both materials and for parts. A key point is that we do need additional R&D to help develop materials that are needed in the manufacturing technologies for fusion. This is more often the case in the situation of technologies that have almost no market outside of fusion, or limited market outside of fusion. And one example is the development of tungsten heavy, which is a very dense alloy that can handle the harsh conditions in a fusion reactor, but otherwise has no market. Whereas something such as the high-temperature superconductors have a very strong market, commercial opportunities beyond fusion. And those supply chains are more mature, but not necessarily at the scale that we need for fusion. And in fact, fusion has helped develop those markets and that supply chain quite well already, even in the development of our pilot technologies. So that's a very short summary of what we looked at on the supply chains. The other piece of the project was looking at the question of cost. So Professor Krush Shervan and a graduate student, Leila Jard, led our techno-economic analysis. In this cost analysis, we examined prior studies and publications that assess the cost for alternative fusion configurations. We also conducted a bottoms-up analysis. One key observation of this is that the fusion reactor equipment is the leading cost contributor to the overall plant cost for fusion. We also concluded that how fusion is regulated can have a very large impact on the overall cost. And the logical upshot of that is that fusion power plant designs need to minimize the risks and governments need to adopt the appropriate and effective policies to ensure safe use of fusion energy while enabling fusion to help contribute to the decarbonization goals that exist in countries and across the world. We also observed that the operating and maintenance costs for fusion power plants can be significant as well. So some key takeaways from the overall study, and I certainly encourage you to go to the MIT Energy Initiative website, search for fusion, and you'll see the report there, and you can get into the details. But a key takeaways from this work is that, as Sergey had indicated, fusion has a potential societal value in the trillions of dollars as we seek to decarbonize the global electricity system. Fusion at the right price can give us great advantage to our society and the scale of multiple trillions of dollars. We also found that the deployment and operation of fusion plants is highly dependent upon the fusion cost, the cost and availability of alternative low-carbon technologies, as well as the what is the carbon constraint that we're working with. That is, how low a carbon content is our electricity being pushed by policy and by governments around the world. We also know that the growth of fusion will be dependent by region based upon the economic and electricity demand growth. And also another key finding within the report, and what was led by John Parsons, was a question of market design. Market design can have a very large impact on the deployment of capital-intensive technologies such as fusion as well as others. So a question of how do you design your electricity market matters as well. The other key finding is that the ability for fusion to scale requires that we have the materials, critical materials, and manufacturing capabilities to support that. Particularly for the niche components, we will need more R&D in that field. And for raw materials, we are not anticipating showstoppers there. There will be some challenges, but no showstoppers to the deployment of fusion. And on the slide, I'd like to also acknowledge the entire project team and all the people who contributed to the project. There were many study participants as well as subject matter experts and support staff who supported this, and as well as this project was supported by E&I, one of the key funders of energy research at MIT. So I thank the participants and all that supported this activity. So with this, I'd like to move into the next phase of the program and invite our panelists, our speakers and panelists, up to the chairs in front. And Dennis White, Professor Dennis White, who was co-PI for this project, he will be moderating the discussion.
I'm going to sit at the end. Great, everyone come up. You know it, Sarah? Yeah. Well, thanks. So I like to, this is, so as a fusion technologist, I guess I scared or inspired Sergey back in Madrid. To me, the value of this, I can say for a person who's worked in fusion for a long time, people who work in fusion, and there's several of them here, we tend to work on this thinking of it as the perfect energy source, and when we make it work, everybody's going to use it because it's so wonderful. That's not how the real world works. The real world works around markets, around price, around availability, and I think for me, the greatest reveal that came from this study was placing fusion, even in some sense limited way because we only considered electricity, but it really placed markers on the ground for us as fusion technologists to understand what we must deliver, in fact, to actually make fusion have a difference. It's the dream that the reason we all started to do fusion. So I'll actually start in inverse in some sense, because what this made me realize about how important market design is. That what market are you going into, how's it incentivized, and so forth. And particularly as we go to a carbon-free energy source, distribution of energy sources, fuel basically almost goes away essentially as a cost, and what happens is its capital cost starts to become dominant. So I'm going to start with John, actually. Please introduce yourself and also comment as to what you're thinking in terms of market design for electrical systems, which by themselves, we were just commenting up in the, we were getting mic'd up, is that this itself is evolving rapidly with things like power purchase agreements which are coming, which are specifically for high-end users like Microsoft and Google. So if you could please comment on that, I think that would be a good starting point.
Sure. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm John Parsons. I'm Deputy Director of Research at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, which in short is a bunch of economists at MIT working in this space. And I think the big issue, Dennis characterized it really well. We've had a electricity system generation which has largely depended on fuel with costs. And that means we've managed our electricity markets where as fuel prices vary, we switch which generators are on and over time might switch from one fuel source to another, and the markets are mainly focused on sorting out that short-term operational characteristic. What we haven't had to deal with as much are exclusively capital-intensive investments, and there are some technical problems with incentivizing investments, long-term heavy capital investments as a result of the way we manage our electricity markets. This isn't just unique to fusion. In fact, all decarbonated, low-carbon generation technologies so far are basically capital-intensive technologies, and you have to make an upfront capital investment. And one of the ways most different societies have decided to do that is to provide a guaranteed revenue stream. Whether in the United States it might be with production tax credits for wind, for example, or for solar, and in Europe, feed-in tariffs or contracts for differences or things of that sort. So you basically are implementing a very different model for how you structure investments in physical assets. And we had gotten away from that for a long window of time, but if fusion is going to move forward, as well as other decarbonized low-carbon generation, we're going to need to reinvigorate our institutions that make decisions about investments on behalf of a whole electricity market, so that you can assure an adequate income stream to pay back the financing of these big capital investments.
Yeah, thanks, John. Staying with, in some sense, markets, and of course, as a fusion person, the question you always get asked the most is when. Right? When is this going to happen? And I would point out we had to, just for the study, we had to make some assumptions about when it was going to appear. We had to make some assumptions about doubling rate of the capability, but you know, we saw the sense that it wasn't shown in the slides, but we took a look at this. I mean, at MIT, our theme has been, let's try to make fusion happen sooner, but like, how soon is soon enough in this? And this goes to Randy and Sergey, who I think really led the charge on trying to understand that part.
Yeah, well, I'll take first dibs on that and then Sergey, but basically, as you saw in some of Sergey's thoughts, you know, well, let me step back a minute. Because of electrification globally, there's going to be a tremendous switching from, say, fossil fuels to electricity, and a lot of people will be joining the middle class in different parts of the world, and so overall there's a tremendous growth of energy demand throughout the world and for electricity throughout the world. And so my view is it's never too late to bring in fusion, because there will always be more demand for electricity. And even in Sergey's plots, if you saw fusion take off, you don't see the green go away. The green stays put. So it's not like you're displacing wind and solar, but they're living together in harmony.
Yeah, well, another dimension, well, typically, if you already see in the report, actually the work has been done like a year ago, right, or half a year ago. Where I'm getting to, well, right now we are seeing explosion of different projections, how AI is going to affect the energy demand and electricity demand. And all these data centers, all these hyperscalers, and well, John Parson is an expert in nuclear, and well, the recent announcement of Microsoft and 3 Mile Island, right, so everybody was excited about that and still excited about that, and well, John maybe commenting on that. So the point is, even these projections which you already saw, which are quite aggressive in terms of the electrification and energy demand, still may be on the low side of what actually will be needed. And so that's one of the reasons we need all of the above. We need as much as possible of this carbon-free energy, or very low carbon energy, or almost carbon-free energy. And so fusion is giving us that promise, and hopefully it's not just a promise.
And to add to that one, a recent one is Google announced a partnership or an agreement with Kairos Power, which is built on it's interesting, it has adjacent technologies to our own work as well too. So this actually goes over to Sarah about technical work, and please introduce yourself as well too. We also had to make assumptions in here that we called it a firm dispatchable power source with some certain amount of availability. If those go away, then its economic attractiveness or its market penetration clearly get impacted. Maybe, and we're going to hear more about this in detail, but could you sort of comment to it in the context of this study about how important availability, component reliability is? Yeah.
So I'm Sarah Ferry. I'm the group leader for fusion materials and components at the PSFC. So a lot of our work is looking at the different systems that mostly tokamak-based power plants would need in order to become power plants, right? And, going from like a research device that does break even up to something that is capable of putting energy on the grid. And so this encompasses everything from like the breeder blanket to really, really reliable like first wall components, all of these things that are exposed to very high temperatures, corrosive working fluids, high energy neutron fluxes, high temperatures. And we know that they're going to need frequent replacement or maintenance because there's no perfect material solution for these. So in addition to thinking about materials development and selection, a lot of what we have to work on is thinking about maintenance from the beginning. So designing components that don't take months to disassemble in order to get in there, in order to do necessary maintenance or replacement, and then get things back online. Because from the research world, we often see major experimental facilities down for months or years whenever upgrades or fixes are needed, and we know that that is not going to be acceptable in a power plant that is designed for commercial use. So there's a lot of different axes to think on, and I think it's one thing we should be aware of is that it's not enough just to say, I'm going to develop a higher performance material that's good for this particular part of the plant. You also have to think about the component as a whole and how it will actually be used, because otherwise you can design yourself into a corner, and it'll be very hard to get out of it when it turns out that it's not very easy to get in there and do replacements or anything like that.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. And for me, as I saw this, and I'm going to turn to Rory now around this is exactly why we have these kinds of studies, because of the complex interplay. As technologists, we just tend to think, I'm going to make the technology better. But what does that mean? Like, what does it mean from an economic point of view? What does it mean from a market penetration point of view? And there's a few things that particularly came out of your aspect of the detailed study of the ISO one, Rory, that came as surprises to me it may be in retrospect not so surprising, about the importance of the cost, of the replacement factors in it, of the materials, of the nameplate power capability of it. And also another somewhat of a surprise is that we tend to think of fusion as like steady state power sources, but actually what popped out was, this actually has a role as what we call a peaker, essentially. Could you comment to that, please?
Sure, yeah, and to follow up on Sarah's point, we kind of run those sensitivity studies of if it takes you 3 months or 6 months or a year to replace something like the first wall. You're seeing hundreds to thousands of dollars of swings in those cost targets, so it definitely has a big impact, maybe even more so than the life of the component itself. But Fusion Rant, future operators perhaps will be able to play a game of prices are low today, perhaps I'm not going to sell power, reserve some of these components. And so I think the operation of some of these devices could be quite complicated. But yeah, we did see that particularly for any plant that pulsed, and so had quite a reasonable ability to change its output every 20 or 30 minutes with those pulses, then it's not that they ran in a peaker in the way that kind of a combined cycle turbine would, but they would be on for days, weeks, and then they would be off for a similar amount of time, and that's where you got that drop in capacity factor. And a lot of that, though, was driven by the choice of alternatives that we did or didn't include. So maybe to circle back to your point earlier about the when doesn't matter, the when matters a bit if someone gets there first. Like, so if someone invents a magical, perfect, clean fuel tomorrow, then anything competing with that clean fuel might be in a bit of trouble. But there are unique features to things like fusion that will also help it.
Thanks. So that's great. And as I said, I really appreciated this. I think these are the kinds of models that we take as technologists and then try to understand what's the most. In fact, it inspired a little bit in my fusion design class that actually happened at that latter end of the study, that I switched from a perfect to a cheaper set of replacement materials because I realized that was probably a good one. Okay, so now we're going to take a few questions from the audience as well too. Please don't be shy. Stick up your hand. Get ready for a good ride.
Rory and I both come from the fission side as well. So it's interesting that you're going to tend to probably think in terms of neutronics more than people who maybe have had most of their career in plasma physics. And everyone's kind of aware of both sides. But when we first started doing a lot of the work with CFS, I think we found that a lot of people were maybe underestimating how impactful, neutrons would be to operations overall, everything from materials, degradation, plus obviously, you need that for, the heat and the breathing in the blanket as well. So I actually think that being on the fission side gives you kind of a good advantage because you're already really used to working in that particular type of environment, as well as also being intrinsically aware of the safety issues that come with any nuclear technology. And so I think it helps you maybe see things in a holistic way that I think is super helpful. So.
Congratulations on it. I mean, and actually you'll see it to sort of preview what's coming. You'll see that a lot of the new directions of research here at MIT are moving us towards these key aspects of the nuclear technologies that are required to actually deliver what we put into the study, which is an attractive energy source. And in a general way, those have tended to lag behind because of a lack of people working on it, actually. And
there's a lot of synergies, right, between
a lot of synergy
and the fusion systems. So it's both communities it's cool to maybe have an opportunity to bring both those communities together more as well.
Don't be shy. Oh, is there something in the back? Yep.
Hi, sorry if I missed this at the start, but how was fission treated in the study? Because a lot of the conclusions that I saw about fusion look very similar to conclusions about the future role of fission in other studies. Yeah.
Sure. So we were we needed to make a decision about this right up front in doing the study. Basically, fusion and fission, as you indicated, compete for the exact same place in the electric grid. We talked here about firm power, and Bob mentioned that they're both energy dense, and that's a particular competitive niche in the electricity market. However, they have differences. They will be advantaged by different technological developments. They have very different safety cases, different political and social acceptance issues. And so what we decided to do was focus primarily on that competitive space that would be common to both of them and identify that competitive space, but not try to understand or make any predictions about one versus the other on those other dimensions as they're going to evolve over the next couple decades. So we didn't try to compare them or anything.
One last one. Yep.
Please hold on one second. I just got to bring you a mic for our recording. Sorry.
I was wondering if you had a chance to take a look at the supply chain, and are there any critical materials that are choke points outside of our friends and neighbors?
Yeah, we did, actually. The general conclusion was there was not any bottlenecks in there. And it actually comes from the very nature of fusion. It's so incredibly power dense. And what you're building has very few specialized elements in it. It's essentially, in particularly magnetic confinement, basically big chunks of steel that are called electromagnets. And what is sort of the exotic components, there's actually not very much in it. There's a few exceptions of things right now, like beryllium, for example, where we have, but that's really, our assessment was really, that was really more a market because there's so little demand for it right now. that's actually why it appears that it might be an issue, but in fact there's alternatives, and then the markets could respond as well too. So in general, we found there wasn't really much of an issue there. Good question. Okay. But I think that was it for them. Thanks to the panelists. Yep, thank you. Good.
So thank you, Dennis, Randy, panelists, and thanks again to the entire group of 30 plus who did the research in this study. I'd like to shift now to the second part of the program, and I want to turn the podium over to Professor Nuno Loureiro, who's the director of the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center. He's also a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT, and he will introduce the next part of the program. Nuno.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Randy, for organizing this wonderful event. I'm delighted to be here. So we're shifting gears a little bit. This part of the session is focusing on what it is that we're doing here at MIT to actually deliver fusion energy, sort of almost irrespective of whether it's going to be beneficial to, well, I guess many of us think of it as, is it going to be beneficial to mankind or not? But some of us are in it just for the science and the thrill of doing great discoveries. And I guess I fit more in the latter category than in the former, but of course I understand the practical considerations are paramount. This is a very brief overview. The real stars of this show are my colleagues who are going to speak right after me, focusing different aspects of what we're doing at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center. So, this is a beautiful picture of what the PSFC is. You're looking at, from above, obviously, this is Mass Ave, this is Albany Street, and the buildings here in pink are the Plasma Science and Fusion Center. And the reason I'm showing you this is not to brag about my realm, but rather to tell you that this is the scale that's required if you want to solve the kinds of problems that are posed by delivering fusion energy, right? This is not tabletop science. This is science that requires big infrastructure, huge teams, a lot of money, okay? So the fusion world is unrecognizable compared to what it looked like 5 years ago. And I think, the PSFC team, led by Dennis White, it was absolutely instrumental in changing what fusion is and as compared to what it was. And so the landmark on that was the launching of the MIT CFS partnership about 5 years ago. And that's really triggered the revolution in how society is approaching fusion research. And, the underlying theme to this is that many of us have had enough with the conversation of 20 years from now. I think we are all firm believers in now is better than later, and there's something we can do about it right now that doesn't have to wait 20 years. And of course, this is rooted in deep technological innovation, which has been sort of the staple at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center for as long as it has existed. It's not just private funding. The US government and governments throughout the world are also aggressively promoting fusion in ways that they weren't doing before. And so I think the most noteworthy event here in the United States was the White House summit a couple of years ago on developing a bold decadal vision for commercializing fusion energy. Right? So decadal means 10 years in case you're not paying attention, right? So this is a very aggressive timeline for when it is that we are actually trying to promote fusion on the grid. And so as a result of that, they've selected a few companies that they've identified as perhaps the most promising in the road to delivering fusion power. And PSFC has very tight collaborations with several of these, and the ones with which we don't, I think they very much want to be involved with us That's a fair statement. Now, this slide is for us in the fusion field. This is a slide that you wouldn't even dream of 5 years ago. So right now we're talking about venture capital upwards of $6 billion raised in the last 5 years for fusion. These are some of the companies. This slide is almost instantaneously outdated the moment you do it, because it seems like every other week there's a new fusion startup. So it's a very exciting space right now with different concepts coming online, people sort of working on this problem from very different angles. And some of these concepts are more promising than others, but I think this is sort of approach that you need, where you need more than one data point to identify what's going to be the most promising technology. And of course, we know in science and in engineering that competition is good, right? So this is what a bubbling, exciting scientific and technological adventure looks like. A lot of people looking at these problems from very, very different angles. So very quickly, to create a device that produces more energy, so if you want to have fusion energy, at least in the magnetic confinement fusion approach, you need strong and efficient magnets to confine the fusion plasmas. And innovating and really sort of setting the state of the art in magnet technology is the key thing that brought us from 5 years to where we are now at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center. We also need peak plasma fusion performance. You can run worse plasmas, you can run better plasmas, and having the knowledge of how to optimize that is absolutely critical. Turns out this is a very complex problem, and not only do you need to do all the high-powered theory that some of us wish they could do, but you also need state-of-the-art computing, machine learning, quantum computing, and it's fantastic in the sense that some of the problems that we are facing in the fusion realm develop tools that are actually transportable to many other problems, problems in other fields of science, and that's also very interesting. We need a way to convert energy into power. So, we didn't get into details about how this actually works, but yet at the end of the day, you're producing high-energy neutrons, and it's that energy that you're trying to tap. And so how you go about doing this is a fascinating scientific and technological problem that I would argue we haven't quite solved, and we need to put more resources behind that. And then finally, we need materials. Fusion devices, the way that we are conceiving them right now, will hold the largest temperature gradient in the solar system. Okay, so the core of the plasma that sits here is roughly at 150 million degrees centigrade. But about a meter outwards, you have a material surface that's perhaps at best at 1,000 degrees centigrade. And so, the materials that are going to withstand that neutron flux and that heat flux are very important for the success of this endeavor. In this session, you're hearing most about magnetic confinement fusion, but the inertial confinement fusion has a very strong and honored presence at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center. You may have heard about the record shots on the NIF facility over at Livermore. Our team is heavily involved in that, and in fact, they're a central piece to that success. So I just want to flag this in case anybody is interested in this. You can ask me or us at the end of the session. This is largely a very optimistic, but also realistic view of things. But that doesn't mean that we've solved every problem, right? And for example, one of the problems we're facing right now is the need to, for developing the fusion workforce, the people who are actually going to man the fusion power companies, for example. So we need to expand fusion education in the U.S. and I think elsewhere. Dennis White has a wonderful paper on this. And the U.S. Academy is just not prepared. We need more fusion instructors. I mean, we have proven here at MIT that we can educate our students very well. So many of the people you'll hear from today were actually our alumni. They are our alumni. And some of us will, go out and, they start fusion companies, not just CFS, but elsewhere. We need capable but sort of fast, not decadal timescales, experimental facilities to test the different parts that go into making a successful fusion power plant. And this is always going to be hard tech. It's always going to be big science. It's never going to be less than millions and millions of dollars. That's just the name of the game. That's sort of the level of resources that you need. And finally, if we're actually serious about having a fusion industry, we need to be very serious about the fusion supply chain, and we need to be very serious about all the commercial opportunities, not just directly in the fusion supply chain, but in all the sort of spin-off technologies, such as, for example, using fusion heating systems for geothermal energy. There's immense commercial opportunity here that goes well beyond the economic value that fusion itself might present. So we won't have time to go into detail in all of these in the following presentations, but I wanted to at least, leave you with some of these keywords so that, for your reflection or to ask us later. So with that, I'll transition to the next speaker, Professor Zach Hartwig.
Hey everybody, good evening. So I'm going to follow on Nuno's presentation and actually talk to you a little bit about some of the things we can do to accelerate, but still be at reasonable scale, which is really the key thing. So this is a picture. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but it's a picture of a facility that we hope to build at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center, and I'll tell you a bit about why it's transformational. So, I opened the slide with a quote from a director of Idaho National Lab I had a conversation with, and he said something which I really liked. He said, if fusion is ever going to be an energy technology, it's a materials problem. Yeah, there's lots of other things in it, but this is ultimately where fusion has to go. And so I really like that quote because it kind of defines this moment in fusion where we're kind of moving away from science program and we're moving towards an energy technology. It's a great quote that sums it up. So, here you can see the graphic we've shown, right? There's 40 private companies. You can see the bubble of fusion that we're in because in the time since Nuno gave his slide and I have, we've raised an additional $7 billion in private fusion. That's great. Okay? So, dozens of companies who were not there 5 years ago are there. Those companies have also changed the national program efforts. They're realigning to support private fusion. They're drawing in the timescales by decades, and this has actually caught serious, parts of the fusion program quite out, right? Materials who have been planned to be deployed in 30 years now need to be deployed in 10. So what are those parts of the fusion program doing to address that? Well, we need to address that. Why? Because every approach that Randy mentioned, doesn't matter what it is, has a materials challenge. And ultimately, you can tie those materials to economic viability. At the end of the day, that's what materials do for fusion. They make it work or not. Okay? So that's why materials are important. We touched on this a little bit. We don't have time to go into too many details, but we have common challenges in fusion, right? Doesn't matter really what the challenge is. One challenge is we make neutrons. Deuterium-tritium fusion is the first fuel cycle we're likely to embrace. It's going to make neutrons. Those neutrons damage materials. They displace atoms in the lattice. They put helium and hydrogen into those materials, and that's a significant problem. And it turns out that the energy that those neutrons interact with the materials, that varies as you move around this device. And so different damage is happening in different regions. It's quite an interesting challenge. What are some of those challenges? Okay, so we have structural materials. Dennis mentioned these are mostly power plants built out of steel. What can happen? Well, you get radiation-induced damage. You get embrittlement. Materials become strong, but they become very weak. They can shatter. You get creep. You get swelling. Materials actually will move. You can actually see the difference in materials that have been in a nuclear environment. They grow, and this can be a problem. Okay? We have chemical compatibility. If we want to put a structural material in contact with a molten salt or a molten metal at 800 C, that's an environment where corrosion becomes very difficult. Okay? We have other challenges. So we have materials in contact with a plasma. We like to think of the plasma, at least in a tokamak, being held in a magnetic bottle, okay? But it's not a perfect bottle. So the materials are interacting quite substantially with the plasma. So we have issues. Fuel, like tritium, is actually sucked up into a material. It's retained. It can be very hard to get out. We actually have radiation damage that can complicate many of the interactions between a plasma and a material. And we're really just starting to explore these interactions in a relevant way for a fusion power plant. We have some more exotic challenges. We have things like functional materials in a fusion power plant. So we have superconductors. Superconducting magnets form one of the key cost drivers of a fusion system in the core. We're going to irradiate those very expensive magnets with neutrons, and they're going to degrade over time. And this is going to have a significant impact on the lifetime of the device and the economics. We have other things. We have browning of optical glass and mirrors and things that we use to provide access to lasers and other diagnostics in these devices. So lots of materials challenges. So what are we doing today, and what are we planning to do? Okay, so what do we do today? Well, one thing we do primarily is we use the fleet of nuclear fission reactors around the world, test reactors, to irradiate materials. Okay, this is a picture of the MIT core. It's kind of a beautiful picture where you see the Cherenkov light. So this is just down the street from us. There's some significant disadvantages. Damage is very slow. It takes a long time to get to relevant regimes. Okay? These are very expensive measurements. There are very few facilities, and they're shutting down. So that's a problem. As we're trying to ramp up this work, facilities are shutting down. The long and few learning cycles means we don't have a chance to do rapid iteration, to design, to test, and then to use that learning to design a better material. And they're not very good fidelity for fusion. We don't get the right kind of damage. We have much lower energy neutrons than high energy neutrons. What's the fusion world doing about this problem? Okay, reactors don't work. Well, currently, the world is planning a device which is going to be many billions of dollars. It may be operational in the 2040s. This is a program called IFMIF. It's mainly driven by Europe and Japanese collaboration. The US is considering doing something similar. It's a massive facility, operational in decades, okay? And we've heard many times that's not going to be acceptable, okay? We have companies who need to make decisions about materials in the next few years, not in the next few decades. Low damage rate, limited exposure conditions. Maybe it's operational in the late 2030s, probably not. And how do you scale a multi-billion-dollar facility to the dozens that might be needed to evaluate materials rapidly? It's a really hard challenge. Okay, so we have to think very differently about how we tackle these challenges for fusion. And I thought what I might do is show you two examples of what we're doing at MIT that are kind of upending this model. Okay, doing things fast, doing things quickly, doing things at very high fidelity by being creative. That's what we do at MIT. So one of the things we mentioned is superconductors degrade under radiation damage. We don't want to wait around to put those materials in a nuclear reactor or wait around for a fusion power plant. What can we do? This is a picture on the right of an accelerator beam line. It's down on Albany Street. And we've come up with a way to essentially put superconductor in cryogenic temperatures, so minus 450 C, put it, run it with current, and actually bombard it with protons. So we can actually get measurements done in the span of minutes to hours that might take weeks to months to do elsewhere. Very low radioactivity. It's right here on campus. It's very easy to do rapid experiments and to do them simply. Okay? So this is just a picture. You can't have a talk at MIT without a CAD drawing and some indecipherable graphics. But we put the superconductor here. We cool it down. We hit it with a proton beam. Why is this important to do? Okay, so here's a plot. Okay. This is accumulating radiation damage. So this is the time that you run your fusion device. And this is the superconductor performance. And one of the things you see is all of the work we've done in the community for the last few decades has been done at room temperature because it's really hard to irradiate things cold. And here is all the irradiation. Here's how things degrade when it's cold. Okay? And when things are cold, they degrade 60% faster than they normally degrade. So all of the work we've done to date has just been upended by this result. Putting things in the right environment, doing it quickly, gets us answers that we need to better design fusion power plants. Okay? The last facility I want to talk about is how do we deal with structural materials. So we have a new technique that's been developed here where we can actually use very high intensity proton beams at higher energy. We can irradiate bulk material specimens, and we get a bunch of advantages, okay? We can actually change the energy of the beam. We can modify the type of damage that we're introducing to materials. We can do this in bulk specimens, which means, we can put those materials into things like tensile tests, okay? Instead of doing TEM imaging and looking at micrographs and other things, we can actually get engineering property data, things engineers want to design materials. And so right now, my last slide, the PSFC is gearing up to basically build a completely new facility, a first-of-kind facility that will be major, which is actually leveraging a lot of the advantages of the infrastructure
at MIT and the expertise to basically build a facility that'll damage materials 100 times faster than the application and 100 times faster than things like IFMIF, the big device I showed you that might be operational in 20 years. And we can actually do this with off-the-shelf technology, and we can have this thing running in 18 months, okay? So we can end up with beamlines that are doing lots of different kinds of irradiation. We can do them in complex environments. We could irradiate material in contact with that hot liquid metal, so we can investigate corrosion radiation challenges. And I think most importantly, given the time scales that we've been talked about, we can get data to companies that need it in the span of years, not in decades. Okay, thanks.
Next. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Cristina Rea. I'm a principal research scientist at the PSFC. So, queuing, damages that Zach introduced, I'm going to talk about disruptions. So, fusion plasmas, we have to confine them at very high temperature, high densities, hotter than the sun, and so we assisted, to highly nonlinear phenomena and interactions, and the interactions of the plasma with the device that is confining it. Sometimes we are unable to control the plasma because of the growth of instabilities. And what can happen, so we are looking now at the plasma and not necessarily at the hardware issues and material issues. So what happens now is that we can incur in disruptions. So the final disruptions can be defined as a sudden loss of control. And I wanted to show you this time series from the Alcator-CMOD experiment that we were hosting at the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center until 2016. And the space will be reused for the facility that Zach was mentioning. So here are normal plasma operations. So typically during experiments, we ramp up the current, we conduct our experiments, and then we ramp it down safely. But what disruptions mean is that this fast loss of control evolves on timescales of milliseconds, and suddenly all current and temperatures drop. And this leads to the loss of a confining poloidal field. The current transients basically in turn induce large forces and currents, and the rapid thermal loss that can occur on sub-milliseconds timescales can also induce thermal damages and surface damages. So time series are what I work day to day with, but it's useful to take a look at at what it means like from the point of view of a video. Here we are looking at video, which used to work and maybe works. Here, yes. This is the camera view from we are looking at the inside of the Alcator-CMOD tokamak. That is the central solenoid. The plasma is heating up, and then at some point it disrupts. What you see there are materials that are being eroded off the walls, as Zach was mentioning before, and the growth of such instabilities that are occurring when the plasma is pushed to beyond the controllability limits. That's associated to the occurrence of disruptions. So this the direct cause is melting of surfaces that are enclosing the plasma. In current experiments, what we do is typically we accept the damage, we live with it, and we continue run our experiments to probe the operational spaces of stability. But when we want to optimize our plasma performances, what we try to do is to mitigate the damage by radiating away as much as and as fast as possible. Going forward, we really need to work on disruption prevention strategies in order to reduce the disruption rate and the disruption risk. And this means detecting the precursor stages and steering the plasma away from the disruptive boundary through interpretable metrics. One tricky thing is that disruptions are not necessarily well described from first principle models. However, we've been operating these devices for years and years, and so we have available a huge amount of experimental data. And so our team at the PSFC has been looking into data-driven and machine learning models, which can provide an explainable proximity to the unstable operational space.
Here in the top panel, you can see, again, the plasma current time trace with the disruption occurring over here. And then overlaid, there is a blue time trace, which was obtained through a machine learning model that is tracking the approaching of the unstable operational space and is giving a warning that a disruption is about to happen several hundreds of milliseconds before the disruption. This basically enables us to take, this was run in open loop, so there was no action and no intervention steering the plasma away from this instability limit. But it gives us confidence that we can actually do experiments and maintain the plasma stability and extend the plasma survivability. In the bottom panel, you can see also that we are able to design algorithms that are interpretable, that are explainable, and that we can design, we can extract important features and contributions to this disruptivity that are useful information for the plasma control system to maintain and preserve the plasma stability itself. And indeed, if we, design these algorithms and we close the loop in real time, we are actually able to demonstrate that the plasma survivability can be extended. This is another example from a grad student work that I'm working with, Andrew Maris, and we ran an experiment last summertime at D3D where we found a collisionality at the plasma edge as an indicator of a disruption risk for a certain type of disruption. We were tracking this in real time. And without the controller in the loop, you could see that the plasma disrupts here at around 3.5 seconds. And instead, with the controller on, we can extend the lifetime and improve on the plasma operational space and the stability limits. ML is great, but we really need data to basically build these models and define these models in an accurate way. And so an additional example of the work that the team is doing is working on interoperable and open source libraries that are available for retrieving quickly data across many different fusion devices. And this actually enables the assembly of big databases for machine learning applications. We just released this product a couple of weeks ago, and it's called Disruption Pi, connects to different data repositories across different tokamak experimental devices and prepares these data sets for us. And this is really an enabling instrument because ML model development is just the tip of the iceberg, while the data preparation part is really like what is time consuming. The disruptions team at the PSFC is really big, includes more than 20 people between scientists, postdocs, and students and collaborators, and ML and AI tools are really used ubiquitously across many different projects. I was able to just give an example of a couple of active projects. We have notable collaborations with CFS, where we are really working towards the disruption prevention strategies for Spark, and we are partnering also with any ENI and the data science team there. And also we have collaborators at Google. The widely spread use of ML and AI tools at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center basically earned the designation of a collaborating center, an IEA collaborating center in AI in fusion and plasma science around the topics of research and education. So this is a 5-year cost-free agreement that we signed last year. It builds on already actively funded grants that we have, and it revolves around 3 main pillars. So the development of open science and fair access to fusion data and metadata information for preservation and provenance tracking. The dissemination of accessible research products to enable cross-pollination among communities and accelerate the development of fusion research. And education, training, and capacity building in ML applied fusion science so that we can work towards a diversified workforce to accelerate progress towards fusion energy. And that was my last slide. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the tritium aspects that have come up a few times so far during this session. So as you may have heard, or you may already know, most of the proposed fusion power plant concepts that is being pursued right now by the private industry will use deuterium and tritium as fuel. So just as a recap, if you're to zoom into that plasma to see the particles that are fusing, you have a deuterium nucleus, a deuteron, and a tritium nucleus, a triton, and those fuse, and then this results in a very high energy neutron. So that's 14 MeV, so it's like about 7 times higher than the fastest neutrons you would see in a fission spectrum. And then helium ash, also pretty high energy. So tritium is scarce. Deuterium is not, but tritium is very, very scarce. And so we know that we're going to have to figure out how to breed our own using the neutrons that come off of the plasma fusion reaction. So over there on the left, in the arrow you can see in the plasma, just a reminder of what that reaction is. D plus T yields a high energy neutron and an alpha particle. And then we can capture that neutron in the blanket that surrounds the plasma core. So we refer to this often just as the blanket, but you'll also hear the terminology breeder blanket. And so this reaction is going to be lithium interacting with a neutron to produce tritium and then some combination of other things, but tritium is the important part there. The breeding blanket also has other important functions. So this includes shielding. The blanket moderates and absorbs neutrons, and this helps shield the magnet, so that's very important to the longevity of the plant. If the blanket wasn't there, it would be much, much harder to sort of extract useful lifetime out of the magnets and the other components. Heat capture, that's a big one. So that heat carried by the neutrons, right, we're going to capture that in the blanket. That's how we're actually going to generate our power. And then finally, tritium breeding, which is one of the major focuses right now of the U.S. fusion technology research community. So this is making more fuel in that breeder. So it's going to contain lithium. Then the neutron from the plasma interacts with the lithium to get tritium that we can, in theory, extract and then use again as fuel. So there's multiple forms of lithium, or lithium-containing materials that you can choose for your breeder blanket. So conventional blankets frequently will use various lithium ceramic solids. There's at least 20 or 30 that have been studied in the literature over the last 50 years or so. Pure liquid lithium, this is one that is being pursued potentially by the UK, has the disadvantage of being very chemically reactive with moisture, so big safety issue, but very good breeding because all of your volume is just breeder material. Molten lead lithium, this is a very popular one right now, and then molten salts like FLIBE. So FLIBE is the current one that has a lot of interest in the fusion community. This is the primary breeder material being pursued by Commonwealth Fusion Systems. Although I want to reiterate, none of these, there's no obvious winner for breeder blankets. We might wind up developing many different kinds, you might see many different kinds deployed, but also crucially, no one has demonstrated a working breeding blanket in a prototypic environment at scale. So even though some of these concepts have more research behind them than others, it's really anyone's game, right? There's no obvious winner yet. So beryllium and lead, you'll see these a lot, beryllium in the FLIBE, lead lithium, there's also certain fluoride lithium salts that contain lead. These are important because they're neutron multipliers. So a neutron that hits one of these that doesn't interact with lithium is going to usually go into an N2N reaction, and what this means is it gives you a nice boost to your tritium breeding in the blanket. As you're designing your blanket, you also need to be thinking about infrastructure for chemistry control and heat removal. And importantly, if you have to think about one metric, if you're listening to talks about breeder blankets, they're going to talk about the tritium breeding ratio, and they're almost always going to just abbreviate this to TBR. And the TBR is very simple. It's just the number of tritons that you're producing over the number of tritons that are being consumed. And the TBR that you need for a plant to be tritium self-sufficient is going to vary based on a lot of different parameters, and that's going to be governed by everything from just the straight-up geometry of the plant and its power production targets to different operating decisions and design choices that the operating company has made. So this is not a set in stone thing. Sometimes you'll hear people say that you just need a TBR of 1 or a TBR of 1.05, so a little bit of margin for uncertainties. And that's not true. So if you were a power plant designer, you really want to think about your entire fuel cycle system and make sure that you know what is the minimum TBR you need to achieve, and then also, is your blanket able to achieve that? Because there's going to be some upper maximum theoretical limit on the TBR that any given blanket can achieve based on the power output of the plant and the geometry of the blanket. It's really just, it's a straight up Neutronics problem. So we are investigating molten salt liquid immersion blankets for the ARC class fusion power plant. This is the concept that is being put forward by Commonwealth Fusion Systems. So a liquid immersion blanket, abbreviated usually to LIB, it's basically a giant tank of molten salt in which the tokamak containing the plasma is sort of suspended or held. And so the reason that we want to do this is that it's very simple. So in theory, you're going to get some cost and design savings just in terms of the structural materials and the manifolds that you need. You maximize solid angle coverage this way of your plasma neutron source. So again, just coming back to neutronics, I want every neutron to interact with breeder and not with a non-breeding structural material if I can. That's also going to give me advantages for activation purposes. It gives you efficient heat removal, very important for high energy density concepts like arc, and the ability to have online chemistry control. So conventional blankets have a lot of research behind them, but they tend to have a lot of really complex solid structures. And this is going to give you activation concerns, lower TBR, and also challenges for maintenance as well. So the high breeding efficiency of the lib is important because this is going to let us do doubling of the tritium inventory a lot faster in a plant. So conventional blankets, we expect to have a doubling time of about 10 years, meaning that the time it takes, you have a certain startup inventory of tritium that your plant needs, and you need to double that because if you're a company, you're going to want to build more than one fusion power plant. And so if we were to use conventional blanket technology, it would take us like over 70 years just to reach, from the time that you start deploying fusion, to reach like 1/10 of a terawatt. So that is not the type of energy penetration that we've been talking about when we talk about why do fusion. So even if you were to solve every other technical problem, if you didn't make a better blanket, you were going to be inherently limiting your industry. So just to sort of, our Libra experiment at MIT is what we are doing to advance molten breeder salt blanket technology. So this is basically trying to use a DT commercial neutron generator to get a prototypic neutron spectrum in representative temperature, molten flibe salt. So this is not going to be the same fluence as a fusion power plant, but everything else is quite similar chemically and neutronically. And this lets us sort of really understand how tritium is going to behave in flibe. We're doing a staged experimental approach going from small to much larger volumes due to the technical challenges as well as the safety challenges that are inherent in working with high temperature materials containing HF and beryllium. So this is really important because there are enormous uncertainties regarding how tritium behaves in flibe, a 3 to 4 order of magnitude spread for things like solubility, diffusivity. We need really good information on this in order to design a working power plant. We cannot go from this type of spread in the data to a plant that we know will work. So that's why it's really important that we have experiments that are designed for reliability and repeatability. I want to emphasize that the breeder blanket is just one part of a very complex fuel cycle system. We need to understand how tritium behaves throughout the entire fuel cycle. So not just the blanket, but also extracting it, purifying it, storing it, re-injecting it back into the plasma. These are all pretty low TRL. So there's a lot of work ongoing to advance these technologies. And so just to recap really quickly, the DT plants, you want to remember they need to breed their own tritium. So for a given concept, how are they doing that? What is their breeder technology? Do they have a concept that is going to double that inventory at a fast enough time to ensure the success of the fusion industry? And finally, here at MIT, just down the street, we're undertaking a very ambitious and staged approach. This is actively underway at the PSFC. It's really exciting work, and we are really looking forward to what comes next out of this project. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ethan Peterson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering and at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center. And neutrons. Sarah just said, again, it all comes back to the neutrons, and that's why I have a job. So we're going to talk entirely about neutrons for the next 5 minutes, more or less. And how do these neutrons impact fusion power plant design? Well, as you've heard throughout the night, they impact it greatly. So the neutrons carry 80% of DT fusion energy. And we use Monte Carlo simulations to sort of calculate the distributions or the populations of these neutrons everywhere throughout the power plant. So they're born here at 14 MeV, and they scatter and lose their energy as they travel down to the thermal range. However, I wrote here that the mean free path, or the average distance between collisions for 14 MeV neutrons in steel, is 5 centimeters. And it takes them 500 collisions to lose that energy. And so what does this mean? This means that fusion neutrons travel extremely far at high energy, and they cause damage, like Zach talked about, They heat things up, they cause dose, they transmute things, and they produce reactions that make things radioactive, which is what transmutation is here. And so in the context of designing a power plant, how does this affect us? Well, we have our plasma here, and we have the neutrons that are flying out, and we have a few different subsystems. We have our magnets, we have a vacuum vessel that has plasma-facing components, and one of the functions or consequences of these neutrons is that we need to capture their energy and generate tritium, which is what Sarah just talked about. But we also have to protect these magnets. So they have very high energy neutrons, displace atoms, cause damage, reduce the superconducting qualities of the magnets. We also have to engineer these plasma-facing components and structural materials to be able to withstand high fluences of high-energy neutron radiation. And we also have to protect workers and the public from direct and shutdown dose. And so the fact that all of these neutrons are traveling very far through this reactor, they significantly impact every single subsystem that goes into the power plant. And this manifests itself in determining system requirements on every single subsystem, more or less, in a fusion power plant. Yet, neutronics calculations often take the longest to execute. So this slows down the entire design iteration process for every single fusion concept. And so what we need is fast and accurate methods to compute the responses of these neutrons and quantify their uncertainties. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but the reason that we need to quantify these uncertainties is so that we can set accurate engineering margins, because overly conservative engineering margins are going to make your plant totally economically unviable. So I'm going to kind of walk through a brief analysis that I like to do called the shutdown dose rate, which is essentially the dose a worker would receive going into the plant to do maintenance after some time of operation. We call that the SDR. And so how do we get there? We start with our neutron transport solve, calculating with our Monte Carlo code where the neutrons go, what their populations are. And this requires some inputs of nuclear data and some model definitions like our little cute reactor concept up here. And what we do is we get reaction rates, neutron reaction rates, and we do what we call an activation solve. So how the atoms in the whole power plant evolve and become different atoms over time. And what that gives us is activated material compositions everywhere throughout the whole power plant. And what this does is now these activated radioactive compositions constitute photon sources or gamma sources. And each of those little bits of material have an associated photon spectrum. And what we need to do is put that photon spectrum into our Monte Carlo solver, do the photon transport, and calculate this map of what the dose would be for workers going into the power plant. And this seems all very, very straightforward. And the reason I like to highlight this sort of workflow is that along the way, we get all of the nuclear responses that we need to analyze or assess any sort of subsystem in the fusion power plant. So for example, from here we get energy deposition, damage, tritium production. From this step, we get things like waste disposal ratings. So how do you store some of the radioactive material that you've produced in your fusion power plant? You also get just the nuclide inventories and a heat that those produce over time. And then from the photon spectrums, we have radiation sources that we need to account for when we're moving them from place to place and do shielding analysis. Now, it would be great if this was so streamlined and it was just very clear that you put your inputs into one code and then you get the shutdown dose rate. But what it actually looks like right now in the current fusion neutronics ecosystem is all of these barriers between these different steps of the code. And these are different codes maintained by different developers, many of which are under export controlled. And a lot of times the software plumbing, which is what I call these little arrows that go from place to place, aren't maintained by any of those organizations. And so you can imagine validating these types of workflows and quality assuring them is extremely challenging for something that's critically important for a lot of safety considerations and regulations. So these barriers, furthermore, from a scientific and a research perspective, prevent our ability to propagate the uncertainties that we need to propagate from one step to the next. And so ultimately, we can't put rigorously determined engineering margins on these types of calculations in the current ecosystem. And so what we've gone and done over the last handful of years is to develop this entire streamlined workflow within a single open source code called OpenMC, which was invented here at MIT by a grad student and his advisor, Ben Forget, the current head of the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering. And what this gains us is that we have single sources of truth for nuclear data and for all of our model inputs, and they're used by every step along the process. And there's one source of truth for all of these modules and the software plumbing that's maintained by a single development team, but it's also community developed. And that's one of the big drivers that I think Fusion needs to sort of latch onto is taking advantage of collaborations and community-driven projects like this to deliver, high performance engineering tools for the design of fusion power plants. And so, yeah, let's see, what's the end point of this? Well, we'll keep going. To end, the goal here is to build an analysis platform that provides us all of the nuclear analyses endpoints in the design of a fusion power plant, and to make this streamlined, user-friendly, high performance, and allow us to propagate these uncertainties to deliver engineering margins on these power plants. And so here I've made this cartoon plot of some example fusion neutronics analyses that I've pulled from the literature for devices of varying size and complexity. And the discrepancy here is what I'm calling the difference between what we compute and what we measure in the experiment. And it's not uncommon to get factors of 10 difference between what we measure and what we calculate. And because neutrons touch every subsystem in the fusion power plant, that's untenable. And basically, if you're carrying 10x engineering margins in many, many places throughout your design, it's not going to work out. And so what this ultimately means is that to have confidence in our predictive modeling tools, we need to find better agreement between experiments and simulations for these very large, complex systems. So bringing something that trends like this down to something that trends like this so that we can actually design systems effectively. So that's the end of my talk.
I suspect we're running later than we should, and that's entirely my fault. I think I spoke for way more than I should have. Should we see if there are questions from the audience so that we don't run out of time? Great. First, and Dennis, it'd be very awkward for you not to be here. So everybody should consider Dennis White as part of this panel as well, if you'll be so kind. Questions from the audience? No?
Oh. He loves to answer them.
Oh. I can suggest a slightly provocatory one, and that is the question of whether fusion energy and fusion science is worth pursuing, even if this study were to conclude that it will never be economically viable. And I have my own answer to this, and I'm actually, this is not a planted question. I'm genuinely curious to see what people think. So let me give you a perspective for why the answer might still be yes. So for example, one thing I work on right now is developing quantum algorithms for solving plasma equations. And it turns out that the fusion community is actually arguably the most advanced community in science and engineering at actually trying to answer this question. Can one solve nonlinear partial differential equations on a quantum computer? Now, I'm interested in this because of plasma physics and fusion, but nonlinear partial differential equations are not the exclusive property of plasmas and fusion, right? Many fields, arguably possibly all fields at MIT that are worth their salt, can one say this live, require nonlinear PDEs. And so we're sort of seeing that, the algorithms that we are promoting for how to solve nonlinear PDEs on a quantum computer are actually of interest across board. So that's for example, one idea that started in fusion, but which I'm sure we'll see many applications in different disciplines. And I wonder if in materials, in machine learning, in the neutronic calculations, in blanket designs, and elsewhere, we're going to see similar ramifications? Dennis, you had your hand up.
So the answer is yes, because as a species, I would argue that we always need to keep challenging ourselves. So you saw how hard it is, by the way, of these 4 talks, right? It is not a cakewalk to make fusion economic and viable. It is going to be very difficult. And honestly, we don't know all of the impediments along the way. They're pretty well characterized now, but we've got to be honest about it. We should do that. And the reason that we do it is because when we try really, really hard things, we find out new things, right? And I think a great example of it, because you alluded to it very quickly, was the geothermal work, is that namely heating these exotic plasmas is very difficult, and we were forced to invent some very exotic kinds of technologies. And it turns out called gyrotrons, which produce very intense submillimeter wave RF. This looks like it actually has some chance of providing deep bore drilling capabilities for advanced geothermal. Like, would you have ever imagined that? That's why we should keep doing this, is because we should keep pursuing this because it's at the frontier of our knowledge and our capabilities.
Even if we, I think we were making. I mean, for like 30, 40 years, I don't think we thought that fusion had an economic outlook, and we still pursued it anyways, right? And I think a lot of great things have come out of the PSFC in the last. And from incredible, just from a science perspective, right? Like, I think we still value that inherently, regardless. So.
Yeah, and the HTS superconductor, which really is why we're on this accelerated path. I think, let's be honest, because it's the most science-knowing path that we're on. Didn't come from fusion. It came from some material scientists doing incredible discovery and advancements themselves. And that's the cool thing about, and it's I think why MIT succeeds so well in something like this. It comes from surprises and multidisciplinary connections that actually allow us to make those deep innovations.
I'd answer your question directly. And it was on, maybe it was Randy's slide, or maybe Bob's slide, but the report doesn't predict what fusion will cost. And it doesn't predict when fusion will happen. And that's because it cannot, right? We cannot actually predict what something will cost until we go out and do it in a commercial environment. And so I think Dennis and I have talked. What's that? You can't just not accurate. Yeah, your error bands are what Ethan showed, right? They're 100x. Who knows, right? And it's not just the technology, it's the environment that you're doing it in. We cannot predict what will be the environment in 50 years. And actually something Dennis and I have talked about, one of the exciting things about starting CFS and seeing what happens with Spark is not actually a technology result or a physics result. It's that unlike every federally funded fusion program ever, CFS will know intimately what it costs to the dollar to deploy fusion technology in a commercial way. And we've never had that before. So it'll actually be one of the first data points we've ever had about what fusion actually will cost. And that's exciting.
Coming from a famous exchange with the leader of the largest fusion program in the world that says this project was designed that we will never know the cost of it.
Right.
Which was a political expediency, but actually what this study, which I tell to my international fusion colleagues over and over again, if it doesn't cost come in at the right cost point, no one's going to use it. And it's like this study clearly showed actually that.
So another thing that might be pertinent to discuss quickly is, so the choice that we made here was highly curated. We chose some of the things that the PSFC is working on because they are mission critical. But these aren't all the mission critical things. So perhaps we can have a little bit of a discussion about what else we could be doing if we had enough resources.
Sky is the limit.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Let's also go back to like the FESAC facilities study, right? So Dennis, you might be the most appropriate to comment on that. But I mean, in Zach's work with the cyclotron, so building materials testing facilities, building an actual like fusion prototypic neutron source, right? So this is an active area in the U.S. right now. We're doing the risk reduction activity for that. But knowing that facility to do what we would want to do is going to cost around $1 billion, right? So we're very resource limited in that regard. Better computational resources.
Sure. We have plenty of questions that are unsolved that, through which we would, benefit by partnering with industry partners that are, whose computational problems are, day-to-day problems. They are addressing those problems in day-to-day solutions. So, yeah, that's definitely things to look at.
But to go back, yeah, I agree with all of these points. And to go back to something that Nuno had mentioned earlier in the talk about the importance of training the fusion workforce, I feel like even if we had a windfall of billions and billions of dollars, we wouldn't be able to functionally spend it correctly because we don't have the people or the educators currently in the system.
And inspired from this study, in fact, with Layla, who we had mentioned, who was one of the contributors to the study, then she and I actually started putting together a generalized cost effectiveness or economic model that showed about is sort of generic to any kind of fusion concept. And what it was indicating is that the key global parameters were power density and the ability to change the damaged materials on a fast time scale. In the economic sensitivity, these came out as the greatest ones. And I would point out is that we tend to not think of those because, in fact, those are two technical topics that weren't directly mentioned in these, which is that the higher you can get the power density globally is attractive. And then it could be that we know, as long as you know when the materials are going to fail, we actually just replace them quickly rather than thinking about them lasting a long time. I think there's a whole set of, the way I look at it, as we cast fusion into more of an economic problem than a physics problem, we're going to start actually revealing more of these challenges.
So thank you for your talk. It's a brilliant introduction to fusion for those of us who are not very familiar with the challenges. I saw on the slides mention of the ITER experimental facility. It would be nice if you could maybe, because this is a big challenge that you're talking about, and I would maybe ask what kind of collaboration do you have with ITER? Because I know from different readings and stuff that they've been doing some good stuff. So how do you describe working together between between Europe and the US on something like this?
I can
Okay, are you going to load this one on me?
jump under the gun then.
Maybe Christina?
We definitely have strong relationship, and we are providing good contributions to the ITER physics spaces, which was actually instrumental to the development of the Spark physics spaces. So all the experience that we gained by studying and preparing for ITER, whenever ITER is going to come up, if it's going to come up, it's been instrumental also for retiring risks on the physics, on some physics aspects for Spark. PSFC team members are actively involved in ITER research through the ITER expert groups and topical groups. So we join meetings every couple of twice a year in different areas. We contribute to specific investigations by gathering data points on experimental devices, conducting modeling, and connecting through the different facilities internationally. So we are pretty much involved in ITER research still.
I think there's some tension on the technology side with ITER. It's nothing's bad. Like we are like really impressed and supportive of like the ITER and the demo teams. Demo being the general, the power plants that would follow like the ITER concept. But one of the issues that we encounter on the technology side is that so like demo is based on ITER, right? And ITER was sort of started in the 80s. And so when you start a project and it has a 40, 50-year timeline to completion, the world and technology is going to kind of evolve separately from you. And so the designs of the power plants that the private industry is looking at, they're very, very different than what ITER is looking at. And as a result, we're taking on like different approaches, et cetera. But the demo program in Europe like remains quite the same. And so there's a mix of things that are very relevant to us and then other things that are just not. And I have found tension in my own program is that, the U.S. has a sort of standard commitment to ITER. And this is great, except for the fact that we have very limited funds available. So if you only have a pie that's this big and most of the pie has to be allocated to ITER and demo, regardless of what the US program is interested in, that creates conflicts, I guess, in terms of like what priorities need to be. And ideally, this goes back to the blue sky thing, is that we would like to be able to do both, but we are resource and people limited.
Well, and ITER is very important. First of all, it reminds us this is hard, okay? And in fact, Spark is actually the only other in construction burning plasma experiment, namely one that gets high energy gain in the world, right? And Spark is hard as well too. And the quote, because it's sent back to me very often because I originated, I said, so ITER has incredible science interest and validity, but it is not economically interesting. Because take the cost point of it, and you can see about how much it costs per unit watt. It's so far off the chart of what we just showed on the plots. So it almost goes back to Nuno's original question: is that would we keep doing this? ITER, even though it didn't have economic projection or viability, was an incredibly worthwhile science project because it built the science basis for what then we could actually launch into this as well too. Programmatically about what it means as fusion as an energy source is a much more complex debate. But I think it is already showing that it's too slow and too expensive. And in some sense, ITER unfortunately can also be a counterexample to people pointing to fusion and saying, look, we told you it wasn't going to work. And I don't think that that's the correct answer. Is that nice enough?
That was very good. Another question there.
You give a mic here.
So this is a very high-level question, and excuse its complete ignorance, but I'm just trying to get an idea in terms of proportionally how much money is being spent or has been allotted, say, relative to the space program in the 60s.
Oh, it's a small fraction of that. Yeah, it's compared to the
Zero.
Well, I mean, cumulatively compared to the space program, it's probably around 5%, something like that, in the world compared to what has been used for the space program. Yeah.
So I'm just going back to Nuno's question. I mean, it would seem like this would have similar importance to the improvement of human existence. Where's the money?
Great question. We should end there.
Well, I mean, no, it is interesting. I mean, because we're often asked, it's like, do we need an Apollo program or something like this? It's actually, I answer no. And the reason for that is because this is a different kind of, I could argue ITER, which is at the $50 billion scale, is kind of like an Apollo scale program. It's like, our end goal is actually not to make just fusion science work. It's to make fusion as an economic energy product. And so those things, like was not that, right? And in so many ways, I think we're trying to make more like a SpaceX, right? That namely, it has a roots in those incredible accomplishments that were done in government and public programs, but it has to have a goal of economic viability. Otherwise, it's going to impact nobody's lives ever.
I would argue that the fusion design space is enormous. There are many possible knobs, just generally speaking, and it's very hard to optimize anything if you basically have 2 experiments or 3 in the world, right? So we are not sampling the space, nowhere close to where we should be in terms of knowing what it is that we do better so that we can maximize fusion power production. So I think we should be building more of these machines.
And they are getting built in the UK and in China, not here. So if you were inspired by anything you saw today, please write your congressman or congressperson and say, why do we have, point out, it was actually up on your slides, we have a cost-sharing program, which is basically like SpaceXing fusion, and against $7 billion, the federal government has allocated $45 million. So only government could say 0.4% is cost matching into this.
Keep in mind the bold decadal vision. So there is.
It's a bold decadal vision where we've wasted 3 years already.
The administration has an official bold decadal vision for fusion. So they've stated that this is a priority to have fusion on the grid by 2035. So what we want to see is the money match bold decadal vision.
But it is an important part of American leadership in this area, where the leading fusion companies are in the U.S., a lot thanks to MIT, I would argue, in this, yet we are not getting the commensurate support that's needed from the public side in this, because this is a big lift about getting these going. So, I'm not kidding. If you're inspired by this and you think this is important, pick up the phone, write a letter. It's like, this is an important thing where we, as a government, are lagging behind.
Here today and all of our audience for your participation in this program. I do want to invite you to our reception downstairs on the first floor, and I hope I can also show you upcoming events. On the 13th of November, we have our next major event at the Wong Auditorium. This is an opportunity to attend our colloquium that we have each year at the MIT Energy Initiative, so we hope you join us there.
I just like the title, Brandon. That could have been like for today.
Yes, exactly. Do plan to join us for that event, and I invite our speakers and all of you to join us for the reception and continue the conversation there. Thank you.